This year, earlier this year, His Majesty the King shocked a lot of people when he announced that Balmoral was going to be open. And not only that, afternoon teas would be served and you could look into areas where you'd never looked into before. Also, literally this year, was the very first time you could have a peek at the balcony. Yes, the royal balcony of Buckingham Palace, the figure where we all look towards, of course, on those massive royal events. And when you think about it, who has stood on that balcony and the history, if that balcony could talk? Everybody from, of course, Winston Churchill to all the major royal events. It's fascinating to think, isn't it, that as a country, we look towards that particular balcony and window whenever we're in times of crisis. And obviously, recently at the sad loss of our wonderful monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, on a very final appearance on the balcony, you did kind of think, didn't you, when you were looking at it, maybe this could be the last time. But of course, people are kind of shocked by the fact that His Majesty the King has opened so many public places, palaces and all that sort of stuff for us, the mere public, to go and have a look round at a price, of course. Now, I've been very lucky in my career to film in Buckingham Palace, to go around most of it, and I've been to certain private events there alongside Kensington Palace. But I didn't know this until recently, and I wanted to share it with you as ever. Maury, good to see you. Thank you so much for your time today, as ever. Nice to have your company. By the way, really glad that you enjoyed the recent video, all, of course, about the royal history, ghosts and all that sort of stuff. Fascinating stuff, isn't it, with the public houses and all of those things that are attached to it. Yes, and what about Abdul Karim? Another one being entrepreneurial with royal finances, some people might say. As many people wrote in the comments, it just proves that nothing's new. And that's what I often say here on the show. Nothing is truly new. It just goes in a circle. And because we're in a pocket, I think, of where we are in our lives, we don't necessarily know all about it. I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong and tell me if you feel the same, man, we're lucky, our generation, because we learned a lot of history in school. Talking to young people today who I work with and stuff, they don't even know the basic sort of stuff about royal history. And you think, really? You don't know that? But it's not taught anymore. It's a shame. I think everything should be taught across all platforms. A little bit of history about everything gives you a lot of knowledge, doesn't it? It's a little bit like this. Edward VII, we know he was a naughty boy, don't we? And as the Prince of Wales, of course, he had his sort of wings clipped on many different occasions by the wonderful monarch that was his mother, Queen Victoria. Now, Queen Victoria, had a bit of a problem with the public because essentially, I would say, looking and reading into her, I think she was actually very shy. And although she'd become, the monarch at a very young age, I think without Prince Albert at her side, she retreated back into that shyness of what she then became. And when you think about it, the Prince of Wales, later of course the King, had a very gregarious sort of personality. We know he went out there, we know he was a bit of a bad boy with mistresses and the music hall and fine wine, song, women and drink, all that sort of stuff. But he was also very clever, as I pointed out on many occasions, as a businessman. He knew really what the public wanted to see and hear, and that was he thought was so important. Now, where he clashed with Queen Victoria was how to make the monarchy profitable. You see, even back then, the government were trying to streamline the money. And obviously, when you think about it, there was a bigger case of people to look after, many more servants, and of course, a big staff entourage at various palaces. And he suggested, this is long before His Majesty the King, King Charles III, that, well, what about opening some of the historic sort of places? Well, she wouldn't have any of it. She said no. And the reason behind this apparently was the police at the time said that they couldn't police every single facet. And of course, people could be sort of stealing things and, maybe going into fine arts and stuff like that. And when you think about it, we've seen it time and time again, people trying to break into royal palaces, intruders, that sort of stuff. However, upon her passing, he revisited this idea because now he could do what he wanted. And this was all actually going to be put into place, initially with just 1 or 2 rooms, firstly at Kensington, and the possibility of Buckingham Palace too. And he felt the public had a right to see exactly what the monarchy did, how they operated, very much forward thinking. And as I said, you've got to remember, he's at the sort of start of the moving picture image, that type of stuff. But what came crashing down, and really what drew a line under it, was nothing to do with the fact that he couldn't get it off the ground. But around the same period, he was told, around about 1903, this is 2 years after the demise, of course, of Queen Victoria, that sadly for him, if he wanted to push ahead and do something like that, there's now a new movement, the suffragette movement. And they apparently, according to a tip-off of the Met Police of the time, they were planning to do something. Now, when you think about the episode with the King's Horse later and all the shenanigans that the ladies that got up to, that did so much for all of the ladies out there to get the vote, you can understand they wouldn't have simply stopped at maybe getting into a major royal palace. And sadly, that idea then was put to bed, as it were. Apparently, it was going to be reopened at some point, but the problem was, by the time it was ready to reopen, of course, then King Edward was rather ill and nearing the end of his very short reign. And that's truly the reason why the palaces took so long to, shall we say, reinvigorate themselves and make themselves very much available to the great British and international public and Commonwealth too. Neil Sean in the very heart of London.